When did you realize your grandfather's bedtime stories weren't appropriate? Grandpa Eli moved in with us when I was 7 years old. My parents said he was getting too old to live alone after Grandma passed, and I was excited because it meant I'd have someone to play with after school. He took the room next to mine, and every night before bed, he'd knock on my door and ask if I wanted to hear a story. I always said yes. His stories were better than anything in my books. They were about a hero named Jack the Clever who went on adventures and always outsmarted the bad guys. Jack would sneak into castles and take treasures from greedy kings who didn't deserve them. He'd trick merchants into giving him food and clothes. He'd break into locked rooms to steal maps that would lead him to even bigger prizes. Grandpa Eli told these stories with so much detail that I could picture everything. The way Jack would pick locks with a bent wire. The way he'd watch a house for days to learn when people left. The way he'd dress differently so no one would recognize him. I thought Jack was the coolest character ever. My parents didn't come to my room at bedtime anymore because Grandpa Eli had taken over story duty. Mom said she was grateful for the help since she worked late shifts at the hospital. Dad was always in his office doing paperwork for his accounting firm. So it was just me and Grandpa Eli every night at 8 p.m. sharp. The stories got more detailed as months passed. Jack the Clever learned how to forge documents so he could pretend to be someone else. He learned how to cut phone lines so alarms wouldn't work. He learned how to sweet-talk people into trusting him before he robbed them blind. Grandpa Eli would act out the voices of all the characters. He'd do the voice of the stupid sheriff who could never catch Jack. He'd do the voice of the rich people who deserved to lose their money because they were greedy. He'd laugh when Jack got away with something especially clever. I'd laugh too, because the stories were exciting and Jack always won. Grandpa Eli started teaching me the skills Jack used. He showed me how to pick the lock on my own bedroom door using a paperclip. He showed me how to move through the house without making the floorboards creak. He showed me how to tell when someone was lying by watching their eyes. He said these were important life skills that would help me be clever, just like Jack. I practiced the lock picking until I could open my door in under a minute. I practiced walking silently until I could sneak up on my parents without them hearing me. Grandpa Eli was so proud. He said I was a natural and that Jack would be impressed. At school, I started telling my friends about Jack the Clever during recess. I'd act out the stories the way Grandpa Eli did, making my voice deep for the rich merchants and high for the stupid sheriffs. My best friend Kevin thought the stories were awesome. My friend Danny said Jack sounded mean because stealing was wrong. I told Danny that Jack only stole from bad people who had too much money anyway, so it was actually good. That's what Grandpa Eli always said. The stories were teaching lessons about how the world really worked. Rich people got rich by being greedy and taking from others, so it was fair for someone clever to take from them. Danny went quiet after that and didn't want to play anymore. I didn't understand why he was being weird about it. The stories were just stories, except Grandpa Eli made them feel so real that sometimes I forgot they were made up. He'd tell me about the time Jack broke into a jewelry store, and I'd ask how Jack knew which window to break. Grandpa Eli would explain in perfect detail, down to the type of glass and the best tool to use. He knew so much that I started to wonder if maybe the stories were based on real things that happened to someone he knew. My third grade teacher, Mrs. Keller, asked me to stay after class one day in October. She closed the door and sat down at the desk next to mine instead of behind her big teacher desk. She asked me about the stories I'd been telling at recess. She said another student's parent had called her because their child came home talking about breaking into houses and tricking people. I explained that I was just retelling Grandpa Eli's bedtime stories about Jack the Clever. Mrs. Keller asked me to tell her one of the stories. I told her about the time Jack broke into a mansion by pretending to be a repairman. He wore a fake uniform and carried a toolbox and knocked on the door during the day when the rich family was home. They let him in because he looked official. He said he needed to check the pipes in the basement, and while he was down there, he found the safe hidden behind a false wall. He came back that night and broke in through the basement window and cracked the safe using a drill. Mrs. Keller's face went pale while I talked. When I finished, she asked me where Grandpa Eli learned these stories. I said I didn't know, but he was really good at telling them because he knew all the details. Mrs. Keller said she needed to make a phone call and asked me to wait in the reading corner. She called someone and spoke in a quiet voice, but I could hear some of what she said. She mentioned my name and said she was concerned about the content of stories being told to me at home. She said the level of detail was alarming and suggested possible grooming behavior. I didn't know what grooming meant, but it sounded bad from her tone. She hung up and came over to the reading corner. She knelt down so we were eye level and told me that someone from the school counselor's office would want to talk to me tomorrow. She said I wasn't in trouble, but that adults needed to make sure I was safe. That confused me because I was safe. Grandpa Eli was my favorite person. He spent time with me every single day and taught me things and made me feel special. Mrs. Keller called my mom and asked her to come pick me up early. When Mom arrived, Mrs. Keller spoke to her in the hallway. I couldn't hear what they said, but Mom's voice got louder, and she said something about overreacting. Then she took my hand, and we left. In the car, Mom asked me what I told Mrs. Keller. I explained about the Jack the Clever stories. Mom was quiet for a long time. Then she asked if Grandpa Eli had ever touched me inappropriately or asked me to keep secrets. I said no because he hadn't. He just told stories. That night, Grandpa Eli didn't come to my room for story time. I waited until 8:30 and then went to find him. I heard voices downstairs. Mom and Dad were talking to Grandpa Eli in the living room. Dad's voice was angry. He said something about inappropriate content and teaching a child criminal techniques. Grandpa Eli laughed and said they were just stories, that kids loved adventure tales, that I was fine. Mom said the school was concerned and that they needed to be more careful about what was discussed around me. Grandpa Eli said the school was full of oversensitive people who didn't understand how to raise a boy properly. Boys needed to learn how the world worked, not be coddled with sanitized fairy tales. Dad told him that if he wanted to keep living here, he needed to stop telling me those stories. Grandpa Eli said fine, he'd stop, but that they were making a mistake. I went back to my room before they caught me listening. I felt guilty for getting Grandpa Eli in trouble, even though I didn't mean to. I just wanted to share the cool stories with my friends. The next morning, Grandpa Eli acted normal at breakfast. He didn't mention anything about the night before. He asked me about my schoolwork and told me to have a good day, same as always. The school counselor called me to her office during math class. Her name was Miss Rivers, and she had a small office with toys and books and comfortable chairs. She asked me to sit wherever I wanted, so I sat in a beanbag chair. She sat across from me in a regular chair and had a notebook in her lap. She asked me to tell her about my relationship with my grandfather. I said he was great and that we did stuff together all the time. She asked what kind of stuff. I told her about the bedtime stories and how he taught me to pick locks and walk quietly. Miss Rivers wrote something in her notebook. She asked if Grandpa Eli ever made me uncomfortable or asked me to do things I didn't want to do. I said no, because he didn't. Everything we did together was fun. She asked if he ever told me not to tell my parents about our activities. I thought about it and realized he had. After he taught me to pick locks, he said it would be our secret because my parents wouldn't understand how useful the skill was. After he taught me to walk silently, he said not to mention it because my parents would think he was teaching me to sneak around. I told Miss Rivers about those conversations. She wrote more notes and asked if there were other secrets. I said no, just the lock picking and the quiet walking. Miss Rivers asked me to describe one of Grandpa Eli's stories in as much detail as I could remember. I picked the story about Jack breaking into a warehouse to steal expensive electronics. I told her how Jack spent 3 nights watching the security guard's patterns, how he noticed the guard took a smoke break at 2 a.m. every night and left his post for exactly 7 minutes, how Jack waited until the 3rd night to make sure the pattern was consistent, how he cut the fence in a spot not covered by cameras, how he wore dark clothing and moved during the guard's smoke break, how he took exactly 3 boxes of merchandise because more would be too heavy to carry and would be noticed immediately, how he sold the merchandise to a fence who wouldn't ask questions. Miss Rivers stopped writing and just stared at me. She asked where a 7-year-old would learn words like fence and merchandise and smoke break patterns. I said Grandpa Eli used those words in his stories. She asked if I understood what the stories were actually about. I said they were about a clever hero who outsmarted bad guys. She said they sounded like instructions for committing crimes. That didn't make sense to me. They were just stories about made-up adventures, weren't they? Miss Rivers said she needed to talk to my parents and that someone else might want to talk to me soon. She asked me to wait in the office while she made some phone calls. I sat in the beanbag chair and looked at the books on her shelf. Most of them were about feelings and family problems. One was called Helping Children Cope with Trauma. I wondered why she'd have a book like that in a school counselor's office. After about 20 minutes, Mom showed up looking stressed. She thanked Miss Rivers and took me home, even though it was only noon. In the car, she asked me to tell her everything Grandpa Eli had taught me, not just the stories, but the actual skills. I demonstrated the lock-picking technique and explained how to walk without making noise and described how to watch someone to learn their patterns. Mom's hands tightened on the steering wheel. She asked why I thought Grandpa Eli knew all of this. I said he must have been really smart, or maybe he knew someone like Jack the Clever in real life. Mom said we were going to have a family meeting when Dad got home from work, and that I shouldn't talk to Grandpa Eli until then. I spent the afternoon in my room confused about why everyone was so upset about stories. Dad came home early at 3 p.m. I heard him and Mom talking urgently in the kitchen. Then Mom called me downstairs. Dad's face was serious. They sat me down at the kitchen table, and Dad asked me to tell him the truth about what Grandpa Eli had been teaching me. I explained everything again. The stories, the lockpicking, the walking quietly, the watching people's patterns. Dad asked if Grandpa Eli had ever taken me with him when he went out at night. That question surprised me because, yes, he had. 3 times in the past month, Grandpa Eli had woken me up around midnight and asked if I wanted to go on an adventure. We'd sneak out while my parents were asleep. He'd drive us to different neighborhoods, and we'd sit in his car watching houses. He'd point out which houses had good security and which ones didn't. He'd point out which houses had expensive cars in the driveway, which meant the owners had money. He said we were practicing our observation skills, being detectives. He said it was our special secret and my parents wouldn't understand because they worried too much. I'd thought it was exciting. We'd get ice cream on the way home and I'd feel special because Grandpa Eli trusted me with grown-up activities. When I finished explaining, Mom had tears in her eyes. Dad looked furious. Dad told me to go to my room and stay there. He said he and Mom needed to talk to Grandpa Eli alone. I went upstairs but sat at the top of the steps where I could hear. Dad confronted Grandpa Eli in the living room. His voice was shaking with anger. He said Grandpa Eli had been grooming me, teaching me to be a criminal, taking me on reconnaissance missions. Grandpa Eli said that was ridiculous, that they were just bonding activities, that boys needed to learn how the world really worked. Dad said he'd called the police and they were sending someone to talk to all of us. Grandpa Eli's voice changed. He said if Dad brought police into this, he'd regret it. There were things about the family that could come out, things about where Dad's parents got the money to put him through college, things that would ruin Dad's reputation. Dad told him to get out of the house immediately. Grandpa Eli said fine, he'd leave, but this wasn't over. I heard the front door slam. Mom started crying. I went back to my room and sat on my bed trying to understand what was happening. My favorite person in the world was suddenly being called bad things. The fun stories and adventures were apparently something terrible. Nothing made sense. 2 police officers arrived an hour later. One was a man named Officer Deborah, and one was a woman named Officer Kane. They asked to speak to me privately. My parents agreed, but said they wanted to be nearby. The officers sat with me at the kitchen table while my parents waited in the living room. Officer Kane had a kind face and spoke gently. She asked me to tell her about my grandfather in my own words. I explained that he was my best friend, that he told me stories and taught me things and made me feel special. She asked what kind of things he taught me. I went through the list again, feeling like a broken record. The lockpicking, the quiet walking, the watching houses, the midnight drives. Officer Deborah wrote everything in a small notebook. He asked if I understood what my grandfather was preparing me for. I said I didn't know. I thought we were just having fun. Officer Kane said my grandfather had been teaching me how to commit burglaries. That word hit me hard. Burglaries, crimes. Jack the Clever wasn't a hero in a story. He was a criminal. And Grandpa Eli had been training me to be one too. Officer Deborah asked if I knew anything about my grandfather's past. I said no, just that he used to work construction before he retired. Officer Kane pulled out a folder and showed me a document. It was a criminal record with Grandpa Eli's name at the top. The list of charges was long. Burglary, theft, fraud, assault, possession of stolen goods. Dates going back 40 years. Some charges resulted in prison time. The most recent conviction was 15 years ago for breaking and entering. He'd served 3 years. I stared at the paper, unable to process what I was reading. My grandfather was a criminal. A real criminal. The stories weren't about a made-up hero named Jack the Clever. They were about Grandpa Eli's own crimes. He'd been telling me about his actual burglaries, just changing the names. And he'd been teaching me his techniques so I could follow in his footsteps. Officer Kane said they needed to find Grandpa Eli because based on what I'd told them, he'd been actively grooming a minor to commit crimes. That was illegal. They also needed to investigate whether he'd been planning new burglaries using me as an accomplice. The houses we'd watched together, they wanted those addresses. I tried to remember. One was a big house with a 3-car garage on Maple Street. One was a modern house with lots of windows on Oak Drive. One was a Victorian house with a turret on Birch Avenue. Officer Deborah wrote down the addresses. The officers spoke with my parents after they finished with me. I stayed in the kitchen, my head spinning. Everything I'd thought about Grandpa Eli was wrong. He wasn't a fun grandfather who told exciting stories. He was a career criminal who'd been molding me into his apprentice. The special time we spent together wasn't about bonding. It was about training. The secrets he'd asked me to keep weren't innocent. They were calculated manipulation. I felt sick. I went upstairs and locked myself in the bathroom. I threw up twice. When I came out, Mom was waiting in the hallway. She pulled me into a hug and said she was sorry. She said she and Dad hadn't known about Grandpa Eli's criminal past. He'd told them he'd made mistakes when he was young, but had reformed. They'd believed him because he'd seemed like a sweet old man who just wanted to spend time with family after losing his wife. They'd had no idea he was using access to me as an opportunity to create a protege. Mom said they should have supervised more carefully, should have paid attention to what he was telling me, should have asked more questions. She kept apologizing, and I kept saying it wasn't her fault. But part of me was angry at them. They'd been so busy with work that they'd handed me over to Grandpa Eli every night without checking what was happening. The police put out a warrant for Grandpa Eli's arrest. They found him 2 days later at a motel 50 miles away. He'd checked in under a fake name, but the motel owner recognized him from the photo on the news and called it in. When they arrested him, they found detailed maps of the 3 houses we'd watched together. He'd been planning to burglarize them and apparently had been considering using me as a lookout or a way to gain entry. Kids are less suspicious. A grandfather with his grandson knocking on a door looks innocent. Once inside, Grandpa Eli could have disabled security systems while I distracted the homeowners with some excuse. The police told my parents this during a follow-up interview. They said I'd been days away from being used in actual crimes. If Grandpa Eli had succeeded in getting me to participate, I could have been charged as an accomplice despite my age. The thought terrified me. I'd come so close to having a criminal record at 8 years old, all because I'd trusted someone who'd pretended to love me but was actually using me as a tool. The betrayal hurt worse than anything I'd ever felt. I'd thought Grandpa Eli cared about me. I'd thought I was special to him. but I was just a means to an end, a child he could manipulate and train because children are trusting and eager to please. Grandpa Eli's trial happened 4 months later. The prosecution charged him with child endangerment, contributing to the delinquency of a minor, attempted burglary, and conspiracy to commit burglary. His defense lawyer argued that telling stories wasn't a crime and that teaching basic skills wasn't criminal either. The prosecution brought in expert witnesses who explained grooming techniques and how Grandpa Eli's behavior fit the pattern perfectly. They played recordings of my interviews where I described the midnight drives and the surveillance of houses. They showed the maps found in his motel room with notes in his handwriting detailing security systems and entry points. The jury deliberated for 6 hours and found him guilty on all charges. The judge sentenced him to 12 years in prison. He'd be nearly 80 by the time he got out. During the sentencing, the judge said Grandpa Eli had violated the sacred trust between grandparent and grandchild. He'd used his position in the family to corrupt a child's understanding of right and wrong. He'd attempted to create a criminal apprentice out of his own grandson. The judge called it one of the most disturbing cases of manipulation he'd seen in 25 years on the bench. I watched from the gallery with my parents. Grandpa Eli never looked at me during the whole trial. Not once. That hurt almost as much as everything else. I started therapy the week after Grandpa Eli was arrested. My therapist was a man named Dr. Levine who specialized in childhood trauma. He had a gentle voice and never pushed me to talk about things before I was ready. The first few sessions, we just played board games and he asked me about school and normal stuff. Then slowly, he started asking about Grandpa Eli. He asked me to describe how I felt when I was listening to the stories. I said I felt excited and special and like I was part of something important. Dr. Levine said those feelings were real, even though the situation wasn't healthy. He said Grandpa Eli had manipulated those feelings to make me compliant. I didn't fully understand at first, but over time, Dr. Levine helped me see the patterns. How Grandpa Eli had isolated me by making our activities secret. How he'd normalized criminal behavior by presenting it as clever and heroic. How he'd slowly escalated from stories to practical lessons to actual criminal reconnaissance. Each step had felt natural in the moment, but looking back, I could see the calculated progression. Dr. Levine said I shouldn't blame myself for trusting my grandfather. Children are supposed to trust their family members. Grandpa Eli was the adult who'd abused that trust. I was the victim, not the perpetrator. School became difficult after the trial. News coverage had mentioned my name, and kids at school knew I was the grandson in the case. Some kids thought it was cool that my grandfather was a master thief. They'd ask me to teach them lockpicking or share more of the stories. Other kids avoided me completely, their parents having told them to stay away from the boy whose grandfather was a criminal. I felt isolated either way. Either kids wanted to glorify what happened, or they wanted nothing to do with me. My teacher, Mrs. Keller, tried to help by having a class discussion about media literacy and not judging people for their relatives' actions, but it didn't help much. Kevin, my best friend before everything happened, was one of the kids who thought it was cool. He kept pestering me to tell him more stories and show him the lockpicking technique. I refused and eventually stopped talking to him completely. I didn't want anything to do with what Grandpa Eli had taught me. I wanted to forget all of it, but I couldn't. The skills were in my brain now. I knew how to pick locks. I knew how to case a house. I knew how to move silently. That knowledge felt like a stain I couldn't wash off. Mom quit her job at the hospital to be home more. She said she needed to be present in my life, to make sure I had proper supervision and guidance. Dad cut back his hours at the accounting firm. They were trying to make up for the time they'd missed while Grandpa Eli had free access to me every evening. I appreciated their efforts, but it also made me feel guilty. Their lives had changed dramatically because of what happened. Mom's identity had been wrapped up in her nursing career, and now she was home all day trying to figure out how to be a stay-at-home parent. Dad was stressed about money because his reduced hours meant less income. I heard them arguing about finances late at night. They'd fight about whether Mom should go back to work, or if it was too soon. They'd fight about the therapy bills that insurance only partially covered. They'd fight about small things that were really about the bigger issue, which was that Grandpa Eli had blown a hole through our family's foundation. The trust was gone. The innocence was gone. We were all traumatized in different ways. Me from the grooming and manipulation. Mom and Dad from the guilt of not protecting me. None of us knew how to move forward. I developed insomnia. Every night at 8 p.m., I'd feel anxious because that's when Grandpa Eli used to knock on my door. My body remembered the routine, even though he was gone. I'd lie in bed wide awake, my mind replaying the stories he'd told. Except now they weren't exciting adventures. They were confessions to real crimes. I knew that when Jack the Clever broke into the mansion, that was really Grandpa Eli describing a burglary he'd committed. When Jack tricked the merchant, that was Grandpa Eli describing a con he'd pulled. Every story had been him reliving his criminal career and passing on his knowledge to me. The realization made me feel dirty. I'd been so eager to learn from him. I'd practiced the skills he taught me. I'd begged for more stories. I'd made it easy for him to groom me. Dr. Levine kept telling me it wasn't my fault, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I should have known something was wrong. Normal kids didn't get bedtime stories about breaking and entering. Normal kids didn't learn lockpicking from their grandfathers. Somewhere in my brain, shouldn't I have recognized this was inappropriate? But then, Dr. Levine would remind me that I was 8 years old when it started. 8-year-olds don't have the experience to recognize grooming. That's what makes them vulnerable. 4th grade was worse than 3rd grade. The news coverage had died down, but kids still remembered. I got into my first fight in October when a boy named Craig made a joke about my grandfather teaching him to steal from the school vending machine. I punched Craig in the face without thinking. We both got suspended for 3 days. Mom cried when the school called her. She said she understood why I'd lashed out, but that violence wasn't the answer. I didn't care. It had felt good to hit Craig. It had felt good to make someone else hurt the way I was hurting. That thought scared me. Was I becoming violent because of what Grandpa Eli had done? Was his influence still shaping who I was? Dr. Levine added anger management to our therapy sessions. He taught me breathing techniques and ways to redirect angry energy. He said anger was a normal response to trauma, but that I needed healthy outlets. He suggested sports as a way to channel physical aggression. Mom signed me up for soccer. I was terrible at it, but running around and kicking a ball did help. The exercise burned off some of the rage simmering under my skin constantly. My teammates didn't know about my grandfather, and I intended to keep it that way. Soccer became my one place where I could be just another kid. I was 9 years old when I got my first letter from Grandpa Eli. It arrived at the house addressed to me in his handwriting. Mom intercepted it and asked if I wanted to read it, or if she should throw it away. Part of me was curious about what he had to say after everything that had happened. The other part of me never wanted to hear from him again. I told Mom to read it first and let me know if there was anything I needed to know. She took the letter to her room and came back 20 minutes later with red eyes. She said Grandpa Eli had written a long letter apologizing and saying he'd made mistakes, but that he'd truly cared about me. He wanted me to know the stories had been special to him, that teaching me skills had been his way of creating a legacy. He hoped someday I'd understand that he'd been trying to prepare me for a hard world where only clever people survived. Mom said the letter was manipulative, and that Grandpa Eli was still trying to justify what he'd done by framing it as preparation and legacy building. She asked if I wanted to keep the letter or destroy it. I told her to destroy it. She burned it in the fireplace while I watched. We got 3 more letters over the next year. Mom burned all of them without reading them to me. She said she'd scanned them quickly, and none contained anything I needed to hear. 5th grade brought new challenges. I started having nightmares where I was breaking into houses and running from police. The dreams were vivid, full of details from Grandpa Eli's stories. I'd wake up sweating and panicking, convinced I'd actually committed crimes. Dr. Levine said the nightmares were my brain processing the trauma and trying to make sense of what had happened. He taught me lucid dreaming techniques so I could recognize when I was dreaming and potentially take control of the narrative. It helped sometimes. Other times the nightmares were too strong, and I'd wake up terrified. Mom started sleeping in a chair in my room on nights when the nightmares were particularly bad. She'd wake me up when I started thrashing and hold me until I calmed down. I hated needing her there, but I was also grateful she was willing to do it. Dad tried to help too, but he didn't know what to say. He'd awkwardly pat my shoulder and ask if I wanted to play video games or watch a movie. His attempts at distraction were clumsy, but I appreciated them. We were all figuring out how to function as a family in the aftermath of Grandpa Eli's destruction. The school suggested I repeat 5th grade because my grades had dropped so much. I'd gone from being a B student to barely passing. I couldn't focus in class because my brain was constantly churning through trauma. Math problems felt trivial compared to the weight I was carrying. Who cared about long division when I was dealing with the fact that my grandfather had tried to turn me into a criminal? Mom fought the school's recommendation. She argued that holding me back would further isolate me and damage my already fragile self-esteem. The school agreed to let me advance to 6th grade on the condition that I attend summer school and tutoring during the next school year. I spent that summer in a classroom relearning material I'd missed while dissociating through 5th grade. The summer school teacher was patient and didn't ask questions about why I'd fallen behind. I was grateful for her professionalism. By the end of summer, I'd caught up enough to move forward. 6th grade started, and I was determined to do better. I threw myself into schoolwork as a distraction from everything else. If my brain was busy with homework, it couldn't spiral into thoughts about Grandpa Eli. I was 11 years old when I learned that Grandpa Eli was sick. Mom got a call from the prison telling her that he'd been diagnosed with cancer and the prognosis wasn't good. She asked if I wanted to visit him. The question caught me off guard. I hadn't seen him since the trial 2 years earlier. I'd successfully pushed him to a distant corner of my mind where he couldn't hurt me. The thought of seeing him again made my stomach twist. But I was also curious. I wanted to look him in the eye and ask him why. Why had he chosen to manipulate me? Why had he risked destroying my life? What had he hoped to gain? Dr. Levine and I discussed it in therapy. He said visiting Grandpa Eli could provide closure, but could also reopen wounds. He asked me what I hoped to get from the visit. I said I wanted answers. I wanted to understand how someone could do what he did to their own grandchild. Dr. Levine said those were valid reasons, but that I needed to prepare myself for the possibility that Grandpa Eli's answers wouldn't be satisfying. Manipulative people rarely take full responsibility for their actions. They justify and minimize and blame circumstances. I needed to go in with realistic expectations. Mom drove me to the prison on a Saturday morning. The building was gray and depressing with high fences and guard towers. We went through security checks that felt invasive and frightening. They searched Mom's purse and made me take off my shoes. We waited in a visiting room with plastic chairs and tables bolted to the floor. Other families were there visiting inmates. A woman with 2 small children, an elderly couple, a teenage girl by herself looking miserable. I wondered what crimes their family members had committed. Were they thieves like Grandpa Eli? Worse? The guard called our name and brought Grandpa Eli in. He'd aged dramatically in 2 years. He was thinner and grayer and walked with a shuffle. The cancer was visible in his gaunt face and hollow eyes. He sat down across from us and smiled weakly. He said my name and reached for my hand across the table. I pulled back. I wasn't ready to let him touch me. His smile faded, and he nodded like he understood. Mom sat next to me but didn't say anything. This visit was for me to get what I needed. Grandpa Eli asked how I was doing. I said fine, even though it was a lie. He said I looked taller and older. I didn't respond. The small talk felt absurd. I asked him why he'd done it, why he'd groomed me to become a criminal. He was quiet for a long moment and then said he'd thought he was helping me. He said the world was a hard place and only clever people survived. He'd wanted me to be clever. He'd wanted me to have skills that would give me an advantage. I asked if he understood that what he'd done was wrong. He said he understood now that teaching a child criminal techniques crossed a line. But at the time, he genuinely believed he was being a good grandfather by passing on his knowledge. I asked if he felt guilty. He said yes, he felt terrible about the pain he'd caused. But even as he said it, I could tell he was performing. The words sounded right, but his eyes were empty. He wasn't genuinely remorseful. He was saying what he thought I wanted to hear. I asked if the stories were really about crimes he'd committed. He admitted they were. Every story about Jack the Clever was a retelling of something he'd actually done. He said telling those stories had been a way to keep his glory days alive. He'd been proud of his criminal accomplishments and wanted to share them with someone who would appreciate the cleverness involved. That admission made me feel sick. He'd been bragging about his crimes to an 8-year-old and framing them as heroic adventures. I asked if he'd planned to actually use me in burglaries. He hesitated and then said he'd considered it. He said having a child with him would have been useful for certain types of jobs. People trust grandfathers with grandchildren. We could have gotten into places an old man alone couldn't access. He said he'd been testing my readiness by taking me on those midnight drives to watch houses. If I'd shown enthusiasm and capability, he would have moved to the next phase. But the school had interfered before he'd had the chance. He said this matter-of-factly, without seeming to realize how horrifying it was. He'd been willing to use me as a tool in actual crimes. He'd been willing to ruin my life for his own benefit. I asked what he thought would have happened to me if he'd succeeded in making me a criminal apprentice. He said I would have learned valuable skills and become self-sufficient. He couldn't understand why that was a bad thing. I realized then that Dr. Levine had been right. Grandpa Eli wasn't capable of genuine remorse. He'd manipulated and justified his actions for so long that he genuinely believed his own lies. There was no moment of understanding coming, no satisfying acknowledgement of the harm he'd caused. He was broken in a fundamental way that couldn't be fixed. I told him I didn't forgive him and I didn't want him to contact me again. His face crumpled and he started crying. He said he loved me and had always loved me. I said love didn't hurt people the way he'd hurt me. Real love protected children, not manipulated them into criminal activity. He kept crying and saying he was sorry. Mom stood up and said we were done. We left him sitting at that plastic table, sobbing. I didn't feel good about making him cry. I didn't feel victorious. I just felt empty. The visit had given me answers, but they weren't the answers I'd wanted. I'd wanted to understand how someone could do what he did, but there was no grand explanation. He was just a selfish man who'd never thought about anyone but himself. The crying was performative, just like the apology. He was crying because he'd been caught and was dying in prison, not because he'd genuinely understood the depth of his betrayal. On the drive home, Mom asked if I was okay. I said I was. She said I never had to see him again if I didn't want to. I said I wouldn't. That chapter of my life was closed. Grandpa Eli died 4 months later. Mom asked if I wanted to go to the funeral. I said no. She and Dad went without me. They said it was a small service with just a few people. None of Grandpa Eli's old criminal associates were there. He'd burned those bridges years ago. In the end, he'd died alone, except for the 2 people he'd hurt most, his son and daughter-in-law. They'd gone out of obligation, not love. Middle school was a fresh start. I went to a different school than my elementary classmates, so nobody knew about my grandfather. I was just another kid. I made new friends who knew nothing about my past. I joined the robotics club and discovered I was good at building things. The precision and logic of robotics appealed to me. There were clear rules and definable problems with solutions. It was the opposite of the chaos Grandpa Eli had created in my life. I excelled at competitions, and my team won regional championships 2 years in a row. My teachers said I had a talent for engineering. Mom was thrilled that I'd found something positive to focus on. Dad started talking about me going to a good college and having a bright future. The nightmares decreased to once or twice a month instead of every night. Dr. Levine said I was making real progress. I was learning to separate my identity from what had happened to me. I wasn't just the kid whose grandfather groomed him. I was someone with interests and skills and potential. The trauma would always be part of my story, but it didn't have to define my entire narrative. High school brought new challenges and opportunities. I got accepted into a prestigious STEM program at a magnet school across town. The coursework was demanding, but I thrived under pressure. Staying busy kept my mind from wandering to dark places. I took advanced placement classes in math and physics. I competed in robotics tournaments across the state. I maintained a 3.8 GPA. My college applications looked strong. Teachers wrote recommendation letters praising my work ethic and intelligence. I'd worked hard to build a life that Grandpa Eli hadn't touched. But occasionally something would trigger a memory, and I'd be right back in that bedroom at 8 years old listening to stories about Jack the Clever. A news story about a burglary would make my heart race. A movie featuring a heist would make me leave the theater. I couldn't watch crime shows without having panic attacks. Those scars were permanent. Dr. Levine said trauma doesn't disappear. It just becomes more manageable over time. I'd learned coping mechanisms and built resilience, but the damage was still there under the surface. I'd be dealing with the aftermath of Grandpa Eli's manipulation for the rest of my life. I was a junior in high school when the documentary came out. A filmmaker had done a piece on criminal grooming and manipulation in families. My case was featured prominently. The filmmaker had interviewed the police officers, the prosecutor, Dr. Levine, and even Mrs. Keller. They'd used actors to recreate scenes from my childhood. Watching strangers reenact my trauma felt surreal and violating. The documentary portrayed me as a victim who'd been saved before irreparable damage was done. The narrator called it a story of resilience and healing. I didn't feel particularly resilient watching the dramatized version of my grandfather teaching me to pick locks. I felt angry that my story was being used as entertainment and education without my consent. Mom had signed a release when I was younger, not fully understanding how the documentary would be framed. She apologized and said if she'd known how invasive it would feel, she never would have agreed. The documentary got picked up by streaming platforms, and suddenly everyone at school knew my story. The anonymity I'd carefully maintained for years was destroyed in 1 hour of television. Kids I'd been friends with for 3 years looked at me differently. Teachers treated me with uncomfortable gentleness. I was back to being the kid whose grandfather tried to make him a criminal. The attention from the documentary was overwhelming. I got messages from reporters wanting interviews. I got messages from other survivors of family abuse who felt connected to my story. I got messages from true crime enthusiasts who wanted details about Grandpa Eli's crimes. I ignored all of it. I deleted my social media accounts and changed my phone number. I couldn't control that the documentary existed, but I could control my response. I wasn't going to become a poster child for child grooming recovery. I wasn't going to give interviews, or write a memoir, or do speaking engagements. My trauma wasn't a platform to build a career on. It was something I was still actively processing and healing from. Dr. Levine said my boundaries were healthy, and that protecting my privacy was important for my mental health. Not everyone who survives trauma wants to be public about it. Some people heal privately, and that's valid. I was one of those people. The documentary had violated my privacy, but I wouldn't compound that violation by engaging with the public's curiosity. Senior year, the attention faded as the documentary fell out of the cultural conversation. I was grateful to be forgotten again. I got accepted to Stanford with a full scholarship for engineering. The acceptance letter felt like vindication. I'd overcome everything Grandpa Eli had tried to do to me and built a future he couldn't have imagined. Mom cried happy tears when I opened the envelope. Dad kept saying he was proud of me. I felt proud too. The 8-year-old who'd trusted his grandfather and gotten betrayed had grown into someone capable of achieving something meaningful. I packed for college in August, loading boxes into Dad's truck. As I was going through my closet, I found a shoebox I'd forgotten about. Inside was the paperclip I'd used to practice lockpicking 10 years earlier. I'd kept it for some reason I couldn't remember, maybe as a reminder of what I'd survived, maybe as evidence that it had really happened and wasn't just a nightmare. I looked at that bent paperclip and thought about how much damage one object could represent. The skill it represented had been meant to destroy me. Instead, I'd survived and built something better. I threw the paperclip in the trash. I didn't need reminders anymore. I knew what had happened. I knew how it had shaped me. But I was moving forward into a life Grandpa Eli had no part in. College was a clean slate, a chance to be just another engineering student with no tragic backstory following me around. Stanford was everything I'd hoped for. Challenging classes, brilliant professors, peers who pushed me to think bigger. I declared a major in robotics and artificial intelligence. My freshman year, I joined a research lab working on assistive technology for disabled children. The work felt meaningful in a way my high school projects hadn't. We were building tools that would improve lives. I was using my intelligence and skills to help vulnerable people. There was symmetry in that. I'd been a vulnerable child once, and no one had protected me. Now, I was creating technology to protect others. My sophomore year, I started dating a woman named Claire who was studying psychology. She knew about my past because the documentary had made it Googleable. She'd watched it before our first date and told me up front that she knew. I appreciated her honesty. She didn't treat me like I was broken or defined by trauma. She treated me like I was a whole person who'd survived something difficult. We dated for 2 years. She was patient with my intimacy issues and nightmares. She understood when I needed space. She reminded me that healing wasn't linear, and some days would be harder than others. We broke up junior year because we wanted different things after graduation. She was going to grad school in New York. I was staying in California for a job opportunity. The breakup was amicable, and we stayed friends. She'd helped me understand that I was capable of healthy relationships, despite everything Grandpa Eli had done to warp my understanding of trust. After graduation, I got hired by a robotics company developing educational tools for children. My job was designing interactive learning systems that made STEM subjects accessible and fun. I thought about the 8-year-old version of myself who'd been so eager to learn from his grandfather. That curiosity and enthusiasm could have been channeled into something positive if someone safe had been teaching me. Instead, it had been exploited and corrupted. Now I was creating learning experiences for other curious kids, experiences that would build their knowledge without manipulation or abuse. My boss said I had an unusual insight into how children processed information. I didn't tell her where that insight came from. Some colleagues knew about my past because of the documentary. Most didn't. I preferred it that way. I was good at my job, and that's what mattered. 5 years into my career, I'd been promoted twice and was leading a team of designers. I'd bought a small house in San Jose. I was building a life that was stable and meaningful. The nightmares still came occasionally. I still avoided crime shows and heist movies. I still felt uncomfortable around elderly men who reminded me of Grandpa Eli. But I'd built coping mechanisms and a support system. I had a therapist I saw monthly. I had friends who knew my story and accepted me. I had work that fulfilled me. I was 28 years old when I got a call from an assistant district attorney. She was prosecuting a case involving an elderly man who'd been grooming his grandson to commit fraud. The pattern was similar to my case. The prosecutor wanted to know if I'd be willing to testify as an expert witness to explain grooming patterns and long-term impacts. I said I'd think about it. The idea of going public with my story again after years of privacy felt terrifying, but another kid was in danger, and my testimony could help protect him. I called my therapist and we discussed it. She said testifying could be re-traumatizing, but could also be empowering. It would be my choice to use my experience to help someone else, rather than having my story exploited by a documentary filmmaker. The difference in agency and purpose mattered. I called the prosecutor back and agreed to testify. The trial was scheduled for 3 months later. I spent that time preparing with the prosecution team. They asked me detailed questions about my experiences with Grandpa Eli, how the grooming had progressed, what techniques he'd used, how it had affected my development and mental health. I answered everything honestly. When the trial came, I sat in the witness box and told my story to a room full of strangers. I described the bedtime stories and the lockpicking lessons and the midnight surveillance drives. I explained how trust had been weaponized against me and how long it had taken to rebuild my sense of safety. The defense attorney tried to discredit me by pointing out that I'd gone on to have a successful career. He suggested that if I'd truly been damaged, I wouldn't be functioning so well. The prosecutor objected, and the judge sustained it. But I answered anyway. I explained that healing from trauma doesn't mean the trauma didn't occur. Survivors can build successful lives while still carrying scars. Functionality doesn't negate suffering. My success was despite what had happened, not evidence that it wasn't harmful. The jury seemed to understand. They convicted the grandfather on all charges. The prosecutor thanked me afterward and said my testimony had been powerful and credible. The grandson's mother hugged me and said I'd helped save her son from years of manipulation. That hug made the re-traumatization worth it. I'd turned my pain into protection for another child. That felt like a kind of justice Grandpa Eli could never take away from me. I flew home to California feeling lighter than I had in years. I'd faced my past in a public forum and used it for good. That was healing I couldn't have achieved in a therapist's office. I'm 30 now. I work for a company developing AI systems that detect grooming behavior in online environments. My childhood trauma has shaped my career in unexpected ways. I understand manipulation tactics from personal experience, which makes me good at identifying them in digital spaces. The algorithms we build protect thousands of children from predators every year. That work feels like redemption. I can't undo what Grandpa Eli did to me, but I can prevent similar harm to others. I'm engaged to a woman named Olivia who teaches elementary school. She knows my full story and loves me anyway. We're getting married next summer and talking about having kids eventually. The thought of being a parent terrifies me because I know how much damage a trusted adult can do. But I also know I'd never hurt my children the way I was hurt. I'd protect them fiercely and teach them that real love means safety, not manipulation. My relationship with my parents has healed over the years. They still carry guilt about what happened, but we've all accepted that Grandpa Eli was the only person responsible for his actions. They were deceived just like I was. We have family dinners once a month and talk about normal things. Work, plans, upcoming weddings. The trauma is part of our history, but it doesn't dominate our present. We've built something new from the ruins Grandpa Eli left behind. Last month, I was cleaning out my garage when I found a box from my childhood. Inside were school papers and old drawings and a birthday card from Grandpa Eli. It was from before everything happened, when I still thought he was just a kind old man who loved me. The card had a cartoon dinosaur on the front, and inside he'd written, "To my favorite grandson, may all your dreams come true." I sat on the garage floor holding that card and crying for the first time in years. Not for Grandpa Eli, but for the innocent kid who'd trusted him. That boy had deserved better. He deserved a grandfather who actually cared about his well-being instead of seeing him as a criminal apprentice. He deserved bedtime stories that were actually appropriate, that taught good values instead of criminal techniques. He deserved to feel safe in his own home. I'd survived what happened to him, but he'd been real, and his pain had been real. I let myself grieve for him, that trusting 8-year-old who'd thought Jack the Clever was a hero. Then I threw the card away and finished cleaning the garage. The past couldn't be changed, but I'd built a future worth living. That was the best revenge against everything Grandpa Eli had tried to do to me. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.